In this video, I want to talk about the development of new Nintendo development teams. What new groups are being formed? What indications do we have for developments in the future? And are Nintendo game development times really ballooning out of control? On this latter point, a comment on a recent video from LoneCom caught my attention, saying, Nintendo games are taking way too long to make. Mario Kart World, Donkey Kong Bonanza, Tomodachi Life, all these games started development in 2017. And of course, there are even more that we could add to this list, Metroid Prime 4 being the obvious one, as well as a whole host of games that released during the Switch era. So is this all a coincidence, or is there a lot more going on? And will these development times continue to expand into the future, or are we looking at a gradual steadying of the ship? We can interpret to some degree from the company's financial context at the time. During the Wii U era, the company actually lost money for a period, and while Iwata committed not to lay off staff, there certainly wasn't any great expansion in this period. Also, the company's 3DS development staff are winding up production on handheld games and needed to make the leap to HD gaming, a tough step up under any circumstances. It all rested on 2017. If the Switch were to prove itself a successful model and have strong uptake, then it would have very different consequences from if the Switch proved another Wii U. As it turned out, the Switch was pretty popular out of the gate, although it should also be remembered that it wasn't yet the mega hit that it became during the 2020s. 2018 had a very sparse lineup of original games, and while the double hit of Pokemon Go in 2016 and the strong Switch launch with Breath of the Wild in 2017 had put the company back into a good position, it was by no means certain that they would stay at this point. I think it's evident, though, that Nintendo were happy to start commissioning a bunch of new games, but that didn't mean they were evenly well equipped to make these games. They had staff working on Pikmin and 2D Mario, but only one group. Splatoon and Animal Crossing were also in the same boat, with the credits showing a clear overlap between the Splatoon 2 and the Animal Crossing New Horizons team. The old top-down Zelda team had been absorbed into the open-air group for Breath of the Wild, and they only just got an original game out with Grezzo Triforce Heroes. In other words, the priority at this time was on expansion after long years of narrowing down to focus on just a few major games. Certainly, Nintendo expanded its core operations. Macro Trends has helpfully graphed this and demonstrated that 2017 stemmed the tide of attrition from the company. Probably natural turnover and a freeze of non-essential new personnel rather than redundancies as far as we can tell. In fact, it was 2018 and 2019, once Nintendo felt reasonably confident that their new console was more than a flash in the pan, that the major expansion in their numbers started to happen. There was a dip over COVID, although of course, because it's a percentage increase, the total numbers are still expanding significantly. But in 2017, there was not a massive hiring rush, despite the system doing quite well out of the gate. So what did we see? Well, there were a few different approaches that Nintendo took during this more tentative period. With the original build of Metroid Prime 4, Famicom Detective Club, and Pikmin 3 Deluxe, they brought in new external teams. They also doubled down on successful partnerships such as Grezzo, Platinum, Tantalus, and Mercury Steam to develop new games. In some cases, though, they looked at leveraging external development talent to build up their existing teams. Koei Tecmo worked extensively on Fire Emblem Three Houses, Eighting ended up supporting heavily on Pikmin 4 after doing the Pikmin 3 Deluxe port, and other groups like Toze helped significantly on Animal Crossing New Horizons. As these teams expanded as well, most of the development heft seems to have been sucked in by a few big teams. It's clear that the Tears of the Kingdom group was hugely swell, for example, but we can also see bespoke efforts to cultivate new groups within the company, most notably Kazuo Takahashi's Donkey Kong Bonanza team, but also smaller groups for projects like Dragon Drive. However, in many cases it seems like the team weren't building on external talent, but were simply reconstructing teams that were previously too underpowered to make an HD title for the Switch. The senior team of Switch Sports and Tomodachi Life are interesting not because they're radical new brooms coming in to put a bold new stamp on the properties. No, these are the same teams that always worked on these properties, just now with a team assembled around them to make this actually a possibility. Sometimes it's a more subtle change that we see. In 2023, we saw EPD10 releasing concurrent titles in the 2D Mario and Pikmin series. Now, New Super Mario Bros. And Pikmin 3 on Wii U were released with only a 9-month interval, but from a review of the more junior credits, it seems that they sucked in considerable numbers of people from outside their core staff as programmers even then, and yet people generally did not stick with Pikmin after that game was completed. And why would they? There weren't any internally produced Pikmin titles for a decade, so it's not like the game could sustain a long-term standing group in the same way that we see lots of people working on Zelda from game to game. But they have since worked on other major titles. So even back then, for games commissioned as a sequel to what was then still a successful console, EPD-10 was stretching to deliver both titles in close succession. And of course, we know that Retro Studios were essentially reconstructed after being left to gradually erode over the mid-2010s, something I've gone into in another recent video. Now, it appears that Nintendo has a very large number of internal staff who are fairly project agnostic, especially in the spheres of art, sound, and UI. But they do have a number of creative hubs where new projects can be put on their feet. We've seen this with ARMS and with Dragon Drive, but the biggest source of these original endeavors appears to be Koichi Kawamoto's department, EPD Group 4. Notably, the Tomodachi Life Living the Dream staff were EPD4 veterans, and we've seen the most discrete groups spring up from there. Even properties where there would appear to be strong overlap don't seem to necessarily be all that connected. While there's some overlap between the fitness and sports staffs, Ring Fit and Switch Sports were largely quite distinct at a senior level. So too Tomodachi and Miitopia, despite their superficial similarities, and we've long observed this with 2D and 3D Mario and Metroid Prime and 2D Metroid, where there are different groups working on properties which might seem to be very similar, but where there's not all that much overlap at all. My guess for why so many of these 2017 games took a long time is that this scaling up was difficult and time consuming for Nintendo, especially for a company as perfectionist as we know them to be. We saw with Metroid Prime 4, for example, a false start in development, and we know that Retro had to be reconstructed extensively from the 2019 reboot, distending the development time of Prime 4 still further. With games like Tomodachi Life and until 2023 Pikmin, it seems like small groups of core developers were allowed to continue to prototype in peace, with major production happening relatively late in the process. But generally, it's not like these most senior developers were being borrowed to other properties, or at least not that the story of the credits can tell from what we've seen so far. We're always looking at things a little bit behind what Nintendo are developing, because of course the game's only released at the end of the process, so it might be several years before we know what might have been happening at the current moment. But these were always aspirations of Nintendo, just ones that it took them several years to be able to meet, I think. They always would have wanted a Tomodachi sequel, it just took them this time to be able to deliver one. Of course, this opens up the question of what next? It would be nice to think that there are other properties where a dedicated crew has been working on rejuvenating them all these years, just like Tomodachi Life, but this generally isn't likely to be the case. The senior people on Style Savvy, Advance Wars, and Wario Land have had other credits since, and there's no evidence that there was ever a hub group around certain properties like Kid Icarus or Punch-Out, so these would need assembling from scratch. I might be missing an obvious property, and I'm sure people will shout out if I am, but in general, I think Tomodachi Life is probably the last property where Nintendo had a core team willing and waiting, but they needed expansion to allow their dreams to be lived. However, creating new groupings around splinter groups is quite possible and indeed quite feasible under the current circumstances. I've discussed before that Splatoon and Animal Crossing seem eminently ripe to separate completely, despite both sharing heavy development resources even as late as Splatoon 3, and I expect that process to continue to the point where games can be put into full production when they're ready rather than being too reliant on key figures working on a parallel game. Then there's the Bonanza situation, where we saw that the EPD group was capable of splintering down and supporting multiple projects. We could definitely see this elsewhere. Notably, EPD9, the Mario Kart team, has a number of younger developers, and with Kosuke Ibuki helping on both ARMS and Dragon Drive, this would be a logical place for the development of new concepts and the nurturing of old ones. I think ARMS is definitely unfinished business for its developers, and I could see them inaugurating a new Mario Kart team to work on updates for World, and then the next iteration of that series going forward, while the ARMS group return to try to get their beloved fighting property back into the big leagues. Then there are obvious places where Nintendo could see branch teams, as with the examples of the Bonanza group, where the team centrally created two or potentially more prototypes, but different groups took them to the finish line. If the Tears of the Kingdom team were to spin out into 2 or 3 different development groups, then even if each of them took 10 or 11 years to create a perfect masterwork, we could still see a couple of games each decade. There's an even easier inflection point with the 3D Mario core team, as 3D Mario has long been classified into sandbox and course-based varieties, and so it would make sense to have different groups working on both of these, given how high profile and big selling the series is. Another team that seems to have managed to subdivide is the Fire Emblem grouping, with Engage seemingly developed largely in parallel with Three Houses, and of course there's the mobile group working on Heroes and Shadows. While much of this is at Intelligent Systems rather than Nintendo itself, it does make sense to me if Nintendo would support and encourage the development of 2 or 3 Fire Emblem teams concurrently, and perhaps they might even then seek to inaugurate new teams around Pushmo and Advance Wars if this were to continue. For Nintendo, I do believe creating a hub for Star Fox will be a priority, and I wouldn't completely rule them out trying to do something with Kid Icarus, but while for fans the romance will always be in the potential of those beloved childhood favourites returning in style, my expectation is that Nintendo will increasingly be focused on the future, with newly formed groups focused on quite different projects. We've seen a few such projects emerge in recent years, and not all of them are traditional games as we might think of them. Labo and Alamo were both fresh approaches to hardware-software titles, and I wouldn't be astonished to learn that they're setting up new groups to develop theme park attractions and original electronic toys. However, as we've now seen, there are those 3 major groups which tend to drive the original projects. Splatoon, ARMS, and Dragon Drive came from EPT5 and EPT9, who otherwise work on Animal Crossing, Splatoon, and Mario Kart, while Labo and Ring Fit Adventure emerged from EPT4. If you look at Dragon Drive as a recent example, director Yoshinori Konishi was a veteran of EPT9, player programmer Hiroku Kamaoi was from EPT8, while UI programmer Orishige had worked on multiple titles, including Zelda and Switch Sports. Nevertheless, it seems that some combination of these groups is where we can expect to see new titles emerge. We already have a good indication that the playtest game emerged from Karamoto's group as well, but when might we expect to see these new titles? Well, the priority for these teams commercially must, I would imagine, be Mario Kart, Animal Crossing, and Splatoon. The first 2 are Nintendo's biggest selling Switch titles by significant margins, and Splatoon is their most successful original franchise in the past quarter century. We know that in the mid-2010s, there were a number of original projects put on their feet. Indeed, Splatoon and ARMS started out this way, probably as a result of Nintendo becoming desperate for results and rolling the dice once more. Mario Maker and Retro Studios' abandoned music RPG Harmony originated in this period as well. However, it's logical with the huge success of Switch that Nintendo could double down for a period on the tried and true and not reinvent the wheel too much. Still, we know from Dragon Drive's developer interviews that there is a prototyping team that was at work in 2023 when they heard about the plan for mouse controls for the new system. This led to Dragon Drive, but it's logical to think that around this time multiple prototypes might have been in development, and perhaps some of them could still be being worked on. After all, Kosuke Ibuki referred during an interview for ARMS to the fact that ARMS was just one of multiple concepts, and that those other concepts might one day eventuate into games in their own right. Just because they haven't yet doesn't mean that they won't in the future. If we look back to the development priorities of Nintendo around 2019, they were scrambling to get Animal Crossing New Horizons ready, and obviously they had a full slate of big titles like Tears of the Kingdom and Splatoon 3 to work on. Then 2020 was the pandemic era, and it strikes me as quite possible that the prototyping team would have been particularly affected. In theory, you can imagine people working on various titles already underway, working from home with individual sections of a game to work on, and with the experience of past versions of that series. But for the prototyping stage, it strikes me that those kinds of projects really require fast feedback and strong communication to really understand exactly what they're building. The Dragon Drive style games, where they experimented with wheelchairs, for example, might be particularly badly hit under work from home circumstances. But then again, we do know that a tiny team created Jump Rope Challenge, and it strikes me as completely possible that other such ideas were developed during this period where the Nintendo staff were forced to work from home. Let's consider the period of 2021 to 22 then. At this point, Tears of the Kingdom, Splatoon 3, and Switch Sports were all wrapping up, and pandemic mitigations were largely in place. It strikes me that this is the kind of time window where Nintendo might have once again placed a priority on developing new concepts that the prototyping team were looking at. Note that the earliest patent relating to the playtest game appears to have had its earliest filing date, September 2023, which would fit with a year or so of development time. The people credited with the game include Tsubasa Sakaguchi, who was the development lead on Labo, which released its final Toy-Con in 2019 in collaboration with Splatoon's Yosuke Amano, who last supervised 2020's Animal Crossing New Horizon. Then there's Masaki Wada of 2019's Ring Fit Adventure, and Shinya Yano, who has worked on multiple EPD9 games, including most recently being the last person credited in the long list of programmers for Mario Kart World, which could potentially indicate that he was involved in the long-running project at an earlier point, and the credit was a relic of this earlier period of work. It strikes me that 2021 to 2022 would be the window that these things would be starting to come together, with bigger teams being assembled around concepts from 2022. That would mean that the game has been 4 years in the making, and if it comes to anything, it will surely be at least a relatively big deal for the company. But that's not the only thing Nintendo is likely to have on the cards. It strikes me as completely plausible that just as 2017 saw a significant number of seeds being planted for future games, some of which have only come out in 2026, that 2022 also saw a good number of the projects that EPD9 and EPD5 have sat on for a long time being greenlit, not just Dragon Drive and the playtest game. Obviously, some of these may fall by the wayside, while the more ambitious of these projects might not even be seen this decade, but there's a good chance that we could start to see some of those projects leading to substantial new games in the next several years. To some degree, we can get a sense by looking at the key development figures who are mysteriously quiet at the moment. For example, Kaori Ando directed Sushi Striker, Astral Chain, Fossil Fighter Frontiers, and Tokyo Mirage Sessions, all new or relatively new IP, but this decade has been at EPD 8 without currently anything to show for herself besides some unspecified credits on Galaxy plus Galaxy 2 and Bowser's Fury, plus a special thanks on Donkey Kong Bonanza. An original project, possibly under the EPD 8 umbrella, seems completely plausible to me. Potentially even she could be working on the next 3D Mario, or possibly an original spin-off. There's also Yuki Kitahara, who hasn't had a credit since Bowser's Fury, and multiple people, such as the reported director of Bowser's Fury, Shinya Hirataki, who was credited as supporting on Bonanza, suggesting that this work was in parallel with another game he was in development for. Again, mainline Mario feels likely, but there are other possibilities still. Even where people have parted ways with Nintendo, I still think there is the possibility for subsequent collaborations. Take the case of Labo designer Shinichi Kasuno, who 6 years ago left the healthcare game software developer Bonbon. It's highly unlikely that someone who left Nintendo would find their way back, but it's not completely unprecedented that if Kasuno still had good relations with the Nintendo developers, that Nintendo could become a publisher for a title from them. Bonbon is difficult to track down information on, but they sponsored research projects on using a game to provide what they called a cognitive battery of tests, exploring different reactions based on age and gender. Remembering how Nintendo tapped into research for the development of the breakout DS hit Brain Age, it seems completely plausible that Nintendo could be interested in developing a game which had a diagnostic or therapeutic element linked to reaction times and cognitive demands that were sensitive to the impacts of age and gender. Then there's Kantaro Tominaga, who was becoming quite a major figure in the Zelda group before he took what I'm sure was a fantastic deal from the Chinese studio Paper Games at the time when China was really trying to hoover up Japanese video gaming talent and set up the Japanese game development brand Infold Games, which then created Infinity Nikki. However, it seems that after our initially strong reaction, fan perception of subsequent updates has been lukewarm, and while Tominaga was scheduled to be at the Game Developer Conference in March 2025 discussing Infinity Nikki, recent interviews don't appear to have referenced him directly, and in one case the interviewer revealed that 6 of the 10 questions she submitted to the team were replied to with a simple no comment, seemingly because of restrictions around being able to discuss monetization practices in the game. Now, Tominaga may be very happy where he is, but the man's last credit was as the director of Breath of the Wild Expansion Pass, and the third credit on Zelda Breath of the Wild itself. He was obviously highly respected and valued at Nintendo, and while Paper Games surely were delighted to leverage his experience, probably for significant remuneration early on, as they drilled down on monetizing the game, you have to wonder what Tomonaga's future may hold. If Nintendo were willing to bring in and build a team around Kazuya Takahashi to give us Donkey Kong, it seems plausible at least they might do the same for Tomonaga, or indeed another person who was previously on the Zelda team. Although even if they did, we would be looking at a release in the 2030s at least, I would suspect. Clearly, any of these returns to the fold will be improbable, and while there are plenty of people who have stayed in the orbit of Nintendo, I can't find many real examples of full-on returns. Satoru Iwata never worked for Nintendo before his long stint at HAL, but he did work very closely with them, and we saw Vivek Malwani of Nintendo Software Technology take a good number of years out before returning to Nintendo, though he was working at DigiPen, which is on the same campus as Nintendo Software Technology, so perhaps not the furthest from the core Nintendo development group. Sakurai set up Sora to develop different games, but then he had to cancel his agreement abruptly when Iwata stealth announced a Wii version of Super Smash Bros. And asked him to lead it, so I suppose that might count if you're being quite loose about it. That said, if you consider the trajectory of Nintendo, which probably didn't feel able to be competitive with remuneration and provision of fresh opportunities in 2017, but which now is certainly looking to expand, it would make sense to keep building bridges with other development teams, and particularly those where they know that they have people who are trained in Nintendo's particular vision for making games. My guess is that many of these projects will be years and possibly more than a decade in the making, but this isn't such a problem if Nintendo can manage to balance out their schedules so that they can space out their major releases a bit more evenly. For more on different strategies Nintendo might use to seek to mitigate long wait times, these videos on screen will have you covered. Thanks for watching, do check out the Patreon for early exclusive and ad-free content, and I'll look forward to seeing you next time for another Nintendo Forecast.